The time normally devoted to a reading this morning is going to be replaced by a video. I confess I'm not as technologically adept as I would like, so I'm going to trust that Michael will make this happen.
I don't even know where one would start.
I feel heavy.
I feel like I can't do anything about it.
I feel in a constant state of anxiety.
I just don't get it.
Just like, why is this still happening?
This is impacting all of us personally.
That's how I feel. Just sick to my stomach.
Anger, anxiety, it is the underlying fabric of my life.
I worked for women's rights for 25 years. That was my job. But fixing this, I don't feel adequate.
I'm so tired.
How is it going to be for me?
I don't know if I'm going to make it back home.
I feel guilty sometimes because I'm not doing enough. And do I need to overexhaust myself or sacrifice my health for the fight?
I'm an immigrant
Being
myself,
a child of
so I feel
immigrants,
like
I'm a
I
Muslim man.
like the way
We came here 17 years ago, and I remember that feeling that we can come here, we will be safe. This is tearing my heart apart, honestly.
Something extremely wrong has happened here.
I question America.
I'm being reminded daily how little Trump and his administration care about my culture. And it makes me sort of question my ability to survive in this world.
A year ago, America went to the polls in the quadri-annual exercise that is our presidential election process. And America chose, remarkably, the candidate unanimously considered to be the absolutely least qualified and most dangerous person to lead our country for the next 4 years. Now, it feels disingenuous to talk about last year's presidential election without talking about the news of this past week. On Monday, indictments were revealed that were handed down to the chairman of the winning presidential campaign and his associate, and a guilty plea was disclosed that hinted strongly that a member of the campaign who admitted to colluding with Russia and lying to the FBI to affect the outcome of the election may have spent the last 3 months wearing a wire and recording phone calls for the FBI. I confess I have a little bit of non-pastoral glee in that regard. A year ago, this day seemed unthinkable to many of us. To believe that enough people could vote for a man so categorically unfit to hold office that he would actually get elected simply stretched beyond any measure of reason. Honestly, I might have more easily believed that scientific developments had caused people to be able to fly than to have predicted the outcome of that election. It boggles my mind still to think that enough people voted to elect a man who is a self-professed sexual predator and who has a disturbing fetish for nuclear weapons. A year ago, on this Sunday, we grieved. We not only had to deal with this loss, but with the added betrayal that comes when people we care about, our neighbors, our co-workers, family members, friends, the betrayal that comes when those people rejoiced at the election results. People were feeling acutely hurt, targeted for hate crimes, genuinely scared for their safety. And for some of us, our loved ones were overjoyed. That hurts double. And then the resistance began, and that has not been an entirely smooth process either. Women of color pointed out that white women overwhelmingly voted for our new president and were again left out of the earliest organizing efforts in the resistance. The Facebook group Pantsuit Nation, which at first seemed to be a safe place to be, then banned a handful of prominent black women organizers, which caused more dissension among the resistance. And in the aftermath of the election, in the aftermath of the organizing, in the aftermath of this past couple of weeks' news about how much social media chatter came out of the efforts of internet trolls from a hostile power. It's hard to think how much of that internal strife, the perpetual Democratic circular firing squad, has been fed by an outside source that targets our fears and encourages us to fight amongst ourselves. Now, since then, the progressive population of the United States has come to the awkward and painful realization that if we are going to survive this thing long enough to elect a new president, that we'd better get over our fixation on cultural or political purity and start building coalitions with our imperfect allies. And so, coalitions formed imperfectly. And we tried to adjust, and we tried to regroup, and the usual kinds of feelings got hurt. And again, I question how much of that hurt feeling chatter was legitimate. How much of it, even now? How much of the Bernie-Hillary fight is merely noise created by an outside entity to get us lathered up and at each other's throats? It feels very Orwellian. The White House press secretary comes to the podium every day and tells us that what our eyes see is not there, what our ears hear is not real, and the environmental reality that our planet is experiencing is not actually happening. Truth is lies, lies are truth. Abandon what your eyes see and your ears hear. They cannot be trusted. Believe what I tell you, even if it runs counter to all the evidence. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. I read George Orwell's classic novel, 1984, years after my time as a radical queer activist, which I credit for the fact that I am not in prison today. And I expect that it is probably for the best that I read that so many years later. I was horrified to see parallels in my current world and the dystopia I read on the page. When I read it, it was 2004, the year Rachel Maddow made her debut as a syndicated radio talk show host. It was the year of Howard Dean's Scream, and a group called the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth that propagated a conspiracy narrative that successfully torpedoed John Kerry's presidential bid. Now, the veterans group offered a story that was patently, provably false, and yet it was repeated often enough that it became part of the culturally accepted historical truth. I remember around the same time I read another book called 1973, Nervous Breakdown, Watergate, Warhol, and the Birth of Post-60s America, by Andreas Killen. Now, in that book, the author talked about how America culturally had swung to the liberal left for years after World War II, but 1973 sort of marked a cultural nervous breakdown where everything sort of snapped and things started swinging back to the right. And it's not the political climate, because remember, that was the year of, Nixon had just been reelected, okay? So politics was in flux. And reading that book shook me deeply. And I remember when I returned the book, I had taken it out of the Southwest Harbor Public Library in Southwest Harbor, Maine. And I was chatting with the librarian, and she asked how I liked it, and I described to her how alarmed it made me when I saw the larger picture that this book illuminated. We were, I remember telling her, marching straight toward the same reality of Germany in the 1930s, if we were not already firmly there. Now, I remember she was horrified that I would say such a thing. Surely I must be exaggerating. That simply could not happen here. And I remember there was an older gentleman who had been standing at the counter waiting his turn while I bent her ear. And he'd been observing our exchange, and this old man looked at me, and he held my eye, and he said with a very heavy accent, "I was there, you are right." So many people are motivated by so much personal ambition and so many repressive personal agendas that they are easily made beholden to the current occupant for the positions that they hold. Former Senator, now Attorney General Jeff Sessions, has been salivating his entire life at the dream of being in a position to keep down women and people of color, and to enforce his fantasy culture of a fictional Mayberry, but as a dry town. He wanted the Attorney General position with the same kind of obsessive fixation that drew Gollum to the One Ring. And he sold his soul to acquire it. And he remains obligated to make regular payments in order to keep it. Same thing goes for former General Kelly, who seemed like a rational man, like the adult in the White House, until he attacked a Gold Star family and a member of Congress who, oh, by the way, happens to be a strong, well-educated, doctorate-holding African-American woman. Now, the accusations he made against her, let me say her name, Congresswoman Frederica Wilson of Florida, the things he said about her were proven false by video 2 weeks ago, and he has steadfastly refused to apologize. I have nothing to apologize for, he said. What is it that he wants so badly? In the position he holds, that he is willing to degrade himself in this way? He has sacrificed his professional reputation as a man of integrity and honor on the altar of, I don't know what. He's a man who's devoted himself to service to something larger than himself, and that has shifted to service to a despot. And I can't figure out why. Curiously enough, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is pretty clear that his job is to make money for himself and his friends. Now, his boss periodically gets in the way of his relationship building by tweeting ignorant and offensive things early in the morning, but for the most part, he seems to be operating outside the purview of the White House. He's doing his job as he understands it, which, like I said, is about making money, in spite of his employer, as opposed to in conjunction with him. So many members of this administration have plainly bitten off more than they can chew, and that is so apparent in the way they are mishandling our nation's affairs. It is as though the current occupant is able to discern whatever it is that is the most needful thing in the heart of each of these cabinet members. And he's found a way to offer to fulfill that need in exchange for fealty or their souls, whichever's cheaper. I return again to a passage by Orwell in which the character Julia speaks to Winston. And she says, "And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. But that isn't true. At the time when it happens, you do mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself." It has been a long, challenging year. Each week, the newspaper, remember newspapers? Each week, the internet tells me, the New York Times online, so, okay. Each week, there's a new revelation of corruption and obfuscation, and the layers are peeled back, exposing layer after layer after layer of corruption and conspiracy and an ethical or a lack of ethical, something that is just beyond what I can wrap my brain around. How do we fight this? How do we bring our world to a place where we live in integrity, where we live in integrity individually, but we bring our larger world and our larger community to a place where we care for those who are most vulnerable among us, where people who have great privilege understand that their obligation is to share, not to accumulate. How do we get there? That is the question. And I believe there is hope. It feels like a year of Pandora, doesn't it? All of the terrible things came out, one after another after another. And there at the bottom remains hope. And so here we are. We're in 2017, and we are still in the United States of America. We are not in 1929 in Eastern Europe. We do still have some semblance of democracy and some infrastructure that resembles a functioning-ish government. Yes, our president is a despot, and he longs for dictatorial power, but there are still good people capable of doing good things within a system that is deeply flawed. Mr. Rogers always told us, in times of catastrophe, look for the helpers. There are always helpers. There's always somebody helping. It can be terrible, but there are people helping. People doing the right thing. Special Counsel Robert Mueller continues his investigation apace, digging deeper each day, impervious to the culture of news leaks that exists in our nation's capital. He has thus far delivered 2 indictments and a conviction. I cannot imagine that he is close to finished. His team of investigators is made up of top-notch lawyers with reputations reminiscent of a team assembled by Eliot Ness. Those of a certain age will remember that. Agents so strong in their personal sense of integrity that they could not be bribed, they could not be threatened, they could not be blackmailed. The mob called them the untouchables. And, you may have heard, there's an election on Tuesday. And for those of us who have not been disenfranchised, we can vote in it. Now, the governor's race here is being viewed nationally as something of a referendum on the presidency, what with how close the current governor is with the current occupant of the White House. In many recovery programs, we hear people talk about doing the next right thing. What is the next right thing for us to do this week? We say that a collection is the sacrament of a freely gathered congregation, but I would say that voting is the sacrament of a free democracy. And there's volunteering. And that doesn't mean you have to be the 20-year-old with the clipboard knocking on doors up and down all the time. It can mean that you offer a ride to a friend who needs to get to the polls. When I lived in Maine, in small towns, the thing I used to do is I would bake cookies for the people who worked at the polls. They had a long, miserable day. Most of them knitted all day. And then, because it was rural Maine, at 8 o'clock, when everybody rightfully should be home and getting ready for bed, they'd pour out the ballots, because they were paper, and they would sort them and count them. But We can thank our poll workers. We can support them. We can continue to call out our legislators and our congressional representatives and our senators. I have friends who, since January 20th of this year, have made it a daily practice to call Washington and talk to the 3 people that they are directly connected to representatively. Their 2 senators and their congressperson. Call every day. And they're free calls. Now, it has been said that you can eat an elephant 1 bite at a time. Not that we necessarily want to eat an elephant, but you get the idea. Let us remember that overwhelm is a strategy that the opposition is using. It has long been the strategy of fascists. It always has been. The strategy is keep the noise coming fast and furiously. Doesn't matter if it's true or accurate or anything else. If we throw enough stuff, some of it will stick. Some of it will do damage. Like in hockey, enough shots on goal, one of them is going to go in. So with that in mind, self-care in this time is an act of revolution. Nationalism depends on us getting tired. Fascism depends on us giving up. We are not in a sprint, nor are we in a marathon. I think that's a poor metaphor. What we are engaged in is a relay race. That means each of us works for a spell. We go as hard as we can, as far as we can, as fast as we can, and when we've done our lap, we hand off the baton to somebody else. We take a breath. We cheer from the sidelines until it's our turn to pick up the baton again and go like crazy. We don't have to run 26.5 miles on our own. We can do this in little bites, in little steps, taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other as we go. We don't have to run a marathon, and we don't have to sprint the quarter mile. If we each take a turn, if we each do our best, and then pass the baton so we can catch our breaths, we've got a shot at getting through this. Now, I want you to pay attention at what's happening on the other side of this political divide, because this is what they're doing. They're taking turns. None of them is on 24/7. Even the current occupant sleeps for part of the night.